Hello lovely people, I'm K3N and welcome to Wonky Wednesday. This week I want to show you how to make a scrappy wonky checkerboard. So I've done some in advance because I want to make a slightly larger one with smaller pieces. So here's half of it and the other quarter, so I'm going to show you how I did it. Now this is not cutting out tiny little squares and sewing them together, it's simpler than that. And it's wonky. But I'm aiming for somewhere in the region of 1.5 inch squares, which when I've taken the seams out will end up inch squares. Now if you wanted to sew loads of 1.5 inch squares together it would be super fiddly, so I'm going to do it like this. Now I'm using just 2 cloths of contrasting colours, and you want a contrast for the checkerboard effect, but you could equally, when you see how you do it, just sew all different scraps together, lights and darks, and then reassemble them and have it really colourful. So the only other thing I've got is just some piecing cotton, and I've got some embroidery floss in similar colours because I might do some slow stitching on the top. A snippy fiskars and needles. So I've got some cloth here. This came out of some of the scraps that my friend gave me. And this piece was from lovely Sheila, hello Sheila, which I've tea dyed. It was a bit brighter and now it's more me. So all I'm going to do is just tear a strip. This is already about the right width. If you want to get a ruler involved, you feel free, but it looks about 1.5 inches to me and it's good enough. So I'm going to tear a strip of this somewhere about the same width, tearing. And I'm going to get this other strip the same length, just match it up, get the bigger scissors because they're laying here, and then I'm going to put them right sides together. Now this has a right side, this cloth. Sometimes I prefer the wrong side. The wrong side of this is just plain beige, and I like the right side, so I'm keeping it right side up. But don't be afraid to look at both sides of the cloth and see which you like the best. And now I've got my piecing. If you want to put pins, feel free. So I've just got my bit of grey piecing cotton with a little knot in the end. Whoop, slid the thing. And I'm just going to make a seam somewhere in the region of 1/4 inch. So I'm going to start with a little back stitch. Now because I'm going to cut this later, I'm going to cut through my stitching, I'm going to use a locking back stitch. So I'm going to hold it up and hope you can see. So what I do, I've already got a back stitch there, so I can just take a normal running stitch. I just take little running stitches when I'm piecing. And now I'm going to take a tiny back stitch, as if we're doing the invisible base, the first step. So a tiny back stitch of like 3 threads of the cloth, and then I come forward for 1 running stitch, and then I come forward again for a 2nd running stitch. And I'll do that again, so I just go back 2 or 3 threads of the cloth, and then forward, forward. And that is a standard piecing stitch. And it takes no more time than a running stitch once you get into the rhythm of it. It's just that you go in slightly behind where you came out. And that little back stitch just helps lock the stitching later on when we start cutting it. And I'm just going to do that all the way along. Oops. So you could just, go through your scraps, find long, thin, long, narrow pieces, and just sew them together, with some contrast, a light with a dark. Just make a whole load of them, and then you can cut them up and sew them back together, and you get a checkerboard. And I'll show you, obviously, what I'm doing. And then you can use those, for whatever. You know what I'm thinking. I'm going to stop with the rice bags at one point. Every time I say it would make a good rice bag, doesn't mean I actually make one, because, I don't have enough hours in the day. Especially whilst I'm here in England with my friend with her wonderful studio, and we're doing so much fun stuff together. It's nice to be with, I mean, she does do hand stitching, but she works in a completely different way to me. So all her toys are different. Yeah, so we do a bit of what I do and a bit of what she does, and we sort of bounce ideas off each other, and, you know, say, oh, you're using that technique, well, I could use that in the way I work. And yeah, it's just great. It's great to spend time with other creative people. And she happens to be a very, very good friend as well, which makes it even better. So I'm just bombing along here. Well, you know, bombing along. But you see that once you get into the rhythm of it, it's just as if you're doing running stitch. You're just taking that little stitch backwards. Excuse me. And excuse the state of my hands. Like I said, I have been playing. Yesterday we did a bit of eco-printy type stuff of a slightly different kind to how I normally do it. And we have bundles to open this morning. So I'm super excited. It's like a child when it's Christmas, you know. I woke up ridiculously early. I still haven't got used to that. There's an hour's difference, if you don't know, between England and France. So the mainland, Europe, is an hour ahead. And I'm an early riser anyway, so I normally wake up around 6. But I'm still waking up at 5. But that's okay. I get stuff done while everybody else is still asleep, like making videos for you. Just got enough thread to get me to the end. And then when I get to the end, I'm just gonna, I can just squeak a couple more stitches out. Do a couple of back stitches to finish. Get that off. So now I've got my 2 strips sewn together. So I just open them up. Now, even if I was an ironer, and we all know I'm not, I wouldn't at this point press that seam with an iron, because all I've done is flip it. It's laying how it was stitched. So all I've done is flip up that one strip like that, and then done it with my thumb, press it with my thumbnails. Because when you come to put the patching together, you can just let the seams go where they want if they don't bother you. You know, nobody's going to come to your house and shout at you because your seams are wrong, certainly not me. But I might want the seams to go different ways, so if I press that in with an iron, I won't then be able to, or it'll be much more difficult to convince the seam to go the opposite way to how I pressed it. I hope that makes sense. So what I'm going to do now is just cut this up. Now bear in mind that you're going to cut they're going to look like rectangles because you've taken a seam here already. So if you cut squares, then you're going to take another seam and you're going to end up with skinny rectangles. So you need to cut rectangles. If it really stresses you out and you'd rather use a ruler, you can get a ruler like this. It's a bit glary, sorry. Lay it there and lay your piece against it. And then you can just eyeball where the 1.5 inch marks are, ish, you know. I don't want you to stress. So whatever makes you happy. Alternatively, you could just think, well, that's about 1.5 inches. Remember, our strips are 1.5 inches wide. So we want to just cut pieces that are about 1.5 inches. And I don't even care if I'm not cutting completely straight, and I don't even care if they're not all exactly the same size. Now here and there, some of your stitching may come undone, depending on where you cut. But by the time you've sewn these together and then sewn them onto a backing cloth, which is something I always do, and then I'll leave that one because it's slightly bigger. Plus I only need 4 because I've already made those. So I'll just take 2 units, I'll just put those to one side. So there you've got a little stack of units that you can then, you know, stitch together however you like. So if you had a stack of all mixed up colours, you could just mix them up, you know. You understand what I mean, of course you do. Right, so I've just got these 2. So I want to make a mini checkerboard, so I'll just turn them around like that. I need more thread. It's all happening. I need to find where I stuck my needle. Was it that one? No, that's too big. Which needle was it? That one. I just like a fine needle for piecing. The finer the needle, a fine needle encourages you to take a smaller stitch. Right. Have a sip of probably now cold tea. Excuse me. Oh, stone cold tea. Well, my granny would have said it's wet and warm, but that's not even warm, that's only wet. Whoops. If you made her a cup of tea, you know, as a child that maybe wasn't up to how she usually liked her tea, but she wouldn't say. And you'd say, "Is it nice, Granny?" And she'd say, "It's wet and warm." All right, so, sorry, concentrate, Catherine. So I've got my two pieces checkerboard styly, so I'm going to flip them right sides together, and I'm going to do the seam nesting. If you've been here a while, you'll know what I mean. It doesn't really matter because we're wonky. For me, it's just a habit because of years of patchworking. If you want to put a pin, you know you're allowed. I'm not going to bother. And now I'm just going to sew those two together again with somewhere in the region of a 1/4 inch seam. You'll never hear me use the word accurate unless it's to say you don't have to be. I read some instructions the other day for something. Oh, by the way, this I'm now just doing running stitch because I'm not cutting this. You can carry on doing the locking back stitch if you love it so much, you know, if you just get into the habit of it. But I'm just going to do running stitch. I flip that seam over out of the way. You can stitch your seam allowances down if you want to. It's just if you don't, then you can manipulate them later to make the piece lay as flat as you like. That's the reason I don't stitch through seam allowances. And later on, when I've got the whole unit stitched, now I'm going to push that seam allowance away. Then I'll decide where I want the seam allowances to make the work lie flat, so it's nice to slow stitch on, so it looks nice. And then at that point, if I was so inclined, I would then go and press with an iron. I quite like things to look rumply. I don't like things all crisp and pressed. But you know, that's just me. That's just me. Yeah, so I was reading these instructions for this project that we were being shown how to make, and it had words like accurately and carefully, and I just felt anxiety levels rising, you know, and I thought, no, this is why I don't do this stuff anymore. Right, snip that off. But you're not ready for next time. So now I've got this little 4-patch basically. Now the proper way, air quotes, to press a 4-patch is to have all the seams going in the same direction. So I've got this one going this way, so this one needs to go that way, this one needs to go that way, and this one needs to go that way. And when you do that, then you can, and you pull your stitching slightly apart because obviously it was stitched in a line, push it down in the middle and you get this cute little 4-patch. Can you see it? In the middle on the back, which nobody ever sees. Every time I see one of those, I think one day I'm going to make something and have them that way up showing, because I just love that. But not today. So, and that's it on its right side. So now I'm going to bring these that I've prepared earlier in. So now I need to stitch that one to that one. So I'm going to stitch them in pairs and then stitch them to that. If you stitch that to that, if you're absolutely not a patchworker, if you'd stitch that to that, then you'd have to stitch into a corner, which is never fun. It's always better to look at a piece and try and work a way out that you can stitch strips and then stitch strips together. So I'm going to stitch these two together and then add them onto there. So now do you see I've got the seams going the same way? That would just make it a bit bulky. So now I can change the seams because I haven't ironed them or anything. I can now just push that seam that way and then do the locking thing. And then later on I can take a view there. Do I need to make them all go in the other direction? So that's why someone asked me a couple of weeks ago when we did seams, and I said about not stitching through them. That's why I like to leave them, you know, hanging loose, so I can push them around. That's not the right needle. That's the right needle. There it is. Where I want them. And then when they are where I want them, that was not an easy sentence to say. Very often I will then baste them all into place. Number one, because I love doing the invisible baste. Number two, because it makes a really lovely flat surface then to stitch on, and it kind of makes the little pieced cloth feel like one. And that is something I picked up years ago from Jude Hill. That idea of basting seams down. So when I get up near the seam, sometimes I take an extra stitch just because that takes a bit more wear, there's a bit more strain on it, but you don't have to. It's just pay attention as you're stitching and observe when you do something, how the cloth responds, and then make adjustments if necessary. I'm only ever here to tell you what I do. It's not the right way, it's not the wrong way, it's just my way. So you see there, that doesn't match, doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. Now I'm near the end, so I'm just going to, whoops, get my thread tangled. I'm just going to do a little back stitch to finish and snip it. And now I'm going to sew the two units together, and then I've got, and to do the other ones took me maybe, I don't know, 15-20 minutes before I turned the camera on. So I know it's slow stitch and we're here to enjoy ourselves and not rush, but for me, piecing things together, well, I do enjoy it, but the real joyousness comes. Now, do you see here, I'm just playing about with this, and even if I twist the seam, I don't really care. This is quite fine cloth, so I think I'm just going to let it do that and that. You see what I'm doing? So I'm just pushing, I'm feeling as much as looking. Does it feel like it's going to lay flat? I think it will. So now I've got this super wonky thing that I want to stitch to there. Do you see? Obviously checkerboard styly. And I don't mind, they're not ever going to all match up, and I don't care if they do or they don't. You see, it's really going like that. But you know, it's Wonky Wednesday. I'm just going to stitch them together. I'm going to play about with the seams as I go. That's much bigger than that. I'm going to just kind of split the difference so it overlaps a bit each side. I'm not forcing anything to fit. I want it to be wonky. I'm just stitching the two things together, and that's all I'm worrying about. So just a normal running stitch. And it's personal choice, I know it is, but I just think it's got much more character when it's wonky than if they were all super precise and matching, and you know. I'm not saying that's wrong. Please don't shout at me in the comments if that's what you like. I think if that was what you liked, you maybe wouldn't be watching Wonky Wednesday. Alright, where's that seam allowances going that way? I'm going to do a little back stitch there in between there, just because it feels like it needs it. I'm going to go through the base of that seam allowance still. I think it's a habit. Just check there that I've got enough of this cloth behind that I can stitch through, you know, that I'm not off the edge of it. Sometimes that can happen when it's all uneven. It's just that paying attention thing. So just, you know, have a look on the other side. You can make adjustments as you go. That's another reason why I don't like pinning these things. I think I'll just stitch through a seam allowance now. Yeah, and it can stay there. I try not to, but if I do, I don't worry about it. Well, my seam's gone a bit big, so I'm just going to creep back out again. And we'll see how it looks in the end. Might look like a real dog's dinner, but I don't think so. I just love the colour of this burgundy cloth that my friend Chrissy gave me against the lovely tea-dyed cloth from Sheila. I'm going to take another back stitch there. I don't know why. Sometimes I don't know why, I just feel it needs it. Through the base of the seam, push that seam away. See, all this adjusting the seams will, if you do enough of this, it will become second nature. You just do it almost without thinking. And that's me to the end. Couple of back stitches, snip it, snip. Put that away. And there we go. Now I need to do something with the seams, but I just think I just love it. Look, this one's really little. Now the outside ones are still a bit rectangular because they're not joined to anything else. But if you're going to use those, I mean, can you just imagine loads of those joined together? You could just make these and then just add them and use all different colours, just lights and darks. It would make a great scrappy quilt. They call a postage stamp quilt, but those are done with the same squares, you know, the exact size and all matchy. But I just love this, and I hope you do too. You know, this happens. And also it kind of inspires your stitching then if you were to put that onto a backing cloth and do some slow stitching on it. You could, you know, things like that. That makes a shape. You can let your stitching come through there because there's an opening rather than feeling confined by the squares. Anyway, enough wittering. I'm going to have a little play about with the seams just so that they feel nice and flat. See where they want to go and see if I'm agreeing, because I'm the boss of them. I think that's all okay like that. It's nice, fine, soft cloth. Well, this is quite high thread count, the burgundy, but the other one is nice, fine cloth. And that's important when you're piecing, when you're putting seams in. Because you see here there are 1, 2, 3, there's 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7 layers of cloth. Is that right? That seems a lot. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, yeah, 7 layers of cloth there, under there. But I can still flatten it, so that's fine. So now what I would do is get something like this. This is floss. Let me have a look. That's a bit bright. I like to use, when I'm invisible basting, I don't really like to use piecing cotton. I sometimes do, just because it's fine and if it's the right colour. So I might use one strand of embroidery floss. It's softer and it just sinks into the cloth better. I'm lucky enough to have this for not much longer because it's running out. This is some darning, vintage darning cotton, and it's this fabulous mushroomy colour, and it just blends with nearly everything. But that's all I've got left. Preciousness. And it's stranded, it's got 4 strands, so I can just take one strand off. And one strand is finer than a strand of embroidery floss, if I can get hold of it. Slightly finer, but it's got the same softness to it. And with vintage thread as well, I always do a little test to make sure it doesn't snap. And I want a needle. I'll empty that one because I know that's the right. No, it's not. It's too big. Excuse me while I find a needle. Where's the one I was just using? That's too big. If you, when you're stitching, something's uncomfortable. There it is. That's, you see, because it's bent. I don't know if you can see it's bent. That's my needle. It's my favourite needle. If there's something not right, if you're hurting yourself, if the thread's not pulling through nicely, you know, if it's something not right, and you're sure the cloth is nice to stitch, you know, it's not because you've got really hard cloth. When I say hard cloth, I mean like high thread count or something of that kind. Try changing your needle. Right, I'm just going to weave about and stitch some of these seams down using the invisible base. So I think I'm just going to come through this way and then through that way and just feel as I go where they are and where they need to be. So I'm going to start on the back with a little knot and a back stitch. Not really necessary for this, but and then I'm just going to come through, and I'm stitching obviously where the seam is, so sometimes I'll be on the dark red and sometimes I'll be on the beige. And I'm just about halfway the seam, and the invisible baste is a little tiny back stitch and on the front and a bigger stitch on the back. And especially when you come to these middle bits, you know, just push with your finger. Make sure they're happy. And hold them. Again, if you want to put pins, if you find that easier. See, now I need to jump across because I'm now into just cloth, but the seam is here and I'm here. But no matter, I'll just take a little tiny stitch on there and hop over it. That won't show, that won't mind, that's fine. I'm certainly not pulling it out. I'm sorry if you heard that motorbike going by. I think most of the background traffic is just kind of a gentle buzz in the background and not too disturbing. Now I need to hop back here again. That motorbike was quite loud. See, theirs feels quite bulky, but I think it's fine. If I can get the baste is almost like you're auditioning it. If I can get the basting stitched through comfortably, then I'm going to be able to do, you know, any other stitching I feel like doing when the time comes. I hope you can see what I'm doing. I'm waving it about a bit. And that can sit like that. Do you see? So I've got that little 4-patch thing, but it's just feeling. And I think it is much more about feeling than looking. I'm going to hop because the seam allowance is behind the dark red again. And apart from flattening the seam allowances and making this lovely flat surface to stitch on, this all helps structurally as well because of the cutting. Although I've never really had anything come apart. You know, I've used this in pieces that have been through the wash, and I haven't had anything coming apart. I do a lot of surface stitching as well, so that needs to be taken into consideration. So I'm just going to take a little back stitch or two, and so I'm going to do that along every, so I'm going to do it, you know, I've just done it there, I'm going to do it along these seams and these seams, and then I'm going to do the same in the other direction, and then I'll be back again. Okay, I've done my seams in both directions, and I've left my thread attached, and I don't know if you can make out, apart from that super rumply bit there, it's really flat now, and it feels much more like one cloth, you know, even though it's got that thickness of the seam allowances. I just think doing that invisible basting along the seams, you see even the back looks pretty flat. So what you could do now, if you preferred the idea of a neat edge, and you know, you weren't going to stitch it to anything else, is you could just go around and turn an edge under and invisible baste it down, you know, if you like that look. I quite like the wonky edge, so I'm going to leave it like that and stitch it to this little bit of very fine vintage cotton. I didn't tea dye it, it was that colour. It was only a tiny scrap, and I wished I had yards and yards of it because I just love it. Anyway, So I'm just going to invisible baste that onto there, and then I'm going to do a bit of stitching on it, fancy stitching. The other thing is, if you wanted to make them, say you wanted to make a rice bag or some other project where you needed them to be, you know, several units the same size, what I would do then is I would just get some bigger strips of cloth, and then I'd just frame them. So I'd just stitch like that, you know, on all four sides, and then I'd cut that then to whatever finished size I wanted. And then you'd have them all the same size. The little units in the middles would be all winky wonky, but you'd end up with, do you see what I mean? That's what I'd do. Rather than trying to calculate to get this right, it would kind of, you know, spoil the point of it. So I'm just going, I might put a couple of pins. I'm just going to invisible baste all around the edge. I'm just going to put a couple of pins here and there. Maybe 4, since we've got 4 by 4 is 16. And I always like to put a backing cloth, but I like the backing cloths to be super fine and soft. I like to stitch through 2 layers, nearly always, when I'm doing my fancy stitching on the top. It just gives it that little bit more body. It maybe comes from when I was a normal quilter. You know, there you've got the 3 layers with the wadding in between and the backing. But I just feel straight away that it's got some nice structure to it, and I like the definition it gives to the stitching then. Although I don't use wadding or batting anymore, unless I've got some little scraps left over. Sometimes I'll use them here and there. You can hide your thread ends if you want to between the layers. You can hop from one place to another between the layers. But mostly it's because I like the feel of it. I like the look of it when the stitching's in. And I enjoy stitching into 2 layers rather than stitching into 1 layer. And I like the softness of the piece then, and I nearly always stitch in my hand and not in a hoop, because I like to feel the cloth in my hand. I just don't like, I don't enjoy the process of having cloth stretched in a hoop and the stitching, you know, in 2 movements. But that is just me. I'm just answering questions that I'm asked, or, you know, think comments that people have made. I'm just explaining in case those people are watching. And I do try to, I read all of your comments, that's for sure. Well, unless YouTube hides them from me. Sometimes I find them. I have to go and look in 2 or 3 places to make sure I can see them all. But I do read them all, and at least give you the, you know, the heart. And I do try to answer as many as I can, certainly the ones that have questions or, you know, longer comments, because I so appreciate you taking the time to comment, or, you know, do the thumbs up thing or all that stuff. Right, what's happened there? There we go, I'm going to need another bit of thread. I'll just shoot through to the back and end it off. On the other hand, it is a little bit of shame sometimes, I think, to cover up all those seams, because there is a beauty in them. But, you know, you can't have everything, can you? And when I see this now, I mean, I've made many of these over the years. Firstly, by machine quilting. It's a technique for making lots of square, you know, 4 patches or whatever, when you need to make a lot of units like that in machine quilting. Where did I finish? there. That's the technique, you do that and you chain piece and you like a little production line, you know, churning out these little squares. And then just one day I thought, well, I love the look of checkerboard. I remember doing that when machine piecing. Can you do it hand stitching? And I tried it first with just a running stitch and it was okay, certainly if you do all this to it afterwards. But then I thought, well, if you use the locking back stitch, then that just gives you that extra level of security with your cutting. And then it just becomes another little element you can use. You know, you can combine it with everything else that you want to. Applique, collage, anything. Any of the other blocks from Wonky Wednesday, you could make a sampler quilt. It's just an element then to be used. And you know, I'm thinking rice bag. Some of you are shouting it, I heard you, that's why, because I wouldn't have said it otherwise, but it's only that I heard you saying it. And if you believe that, you believe anything. So I think what I'm going to do then is just, I feel like doing a circle on it. I think because it's a grid, so it's very linear, and even though it's wonky, I feel like it needs a circle. So I think I'm going to do that. I've got a big cushion that I made the cover for, that I used to sit up in bed, and that's got some wonky checkerboard in it. And in that, with the fancy, you know, stitching and decorative stitching, you can pick out, you know, like you can see that as a foil patch, so you could stitch around that, or, you know, if you had a bigger piece, you could pick a 9 patch somewhere, you know, you can, like, here's a 9 patch, and so you could emphasize that and do something else here. It just gives you a jumping off point. I think it's just lovely little pieced cloths. I turned one into a kind of representation of my garden. I think I have shown you those cushions. I think I showed you them right at the beginning of this series. There, my backing cloth's not quite big enough, so I'm going to have to just come in slightly. There we go. So I can finish that off and get the pins out. Put that in the oats, precious thing. And I'm going to do, I think, just a little circle, and I don't know if I'm going to put it slap bang in the middle. I might put it to one side. See that rumply bit? That's completely tamed now. There was no need to get the iron out. Where do I fancy it? Now I just have these little templates. This is cut out of an old envelope. See, it's absolutely full of holes. I use them until they fall apart, and then I make another one. I just drew round something. I have all different sizes. I just prefer to do that rather than drawing on the cloth. It's just me. Now I can't decide where to put it. There, I think. Maybe there. I don't know. Yeah, I think I like it. Maybe there. I'm sort of visualising there where my stitch, because I'm going to stitch around the edge of it, where my stitching's going to go. I think there was best. And so make sure my pins are not sticking out of the edge, because they'll get in the way of my stitching. And here the little applique pins come into their own. As most of you know, I don't hardly use anything else. They're just polite, they don't bite. And if they do bite, they just nip. They don't bite very hard. I mean, they don't prick you, obviously. Right, I've got some vintage floss. It's not a brand I know, Rose brand. I'll pull some off. but it was the same colour as the dark red. I'm going to have 2 strands. This is not as soft as DMC. Some of this vintage thread is slightly harder, but the colour's right, so I'm using it. Lazy girl length. That's not the right needle. I must get round to sorting my needles into my lovely needle case from Diane. If you've seen the video last week of all the lovely gifts I was given. I don't have all my needles here with me, but some of them are in France, but I could make a start. It's just so much to do here. So much stuff to do. Places to go, things to do down in my friend's studio, lovely food to cook and share. I'm having a lovely time. Okay, so I'm just going to come through on the edge of my circle and just do running stitches all around the edge. For starters, see where the seam is, it does kind of gently interrupt you. You have to decide, do I want to stitch over it, or do I want to adjust the length of my stitch? Whoops, sorry I knocked you. Actually this dark red, although it's quite a higher thread count than I'm used to, is very nice to stitch. Or you can just ignore the seams and just stitch as if you're stitching on one piece of cloth. It's just your own process, whatever makes you happy. So once I've gone once around, I can get the template off. I also like to pull my stitches up so they create a slight ripple in the cloth. I like to play with the tension in the stitching, not too much, or you'll end up with a pyramid. Especially when you're stitching a circle, it can start to push up in the middle. And then what I generally do then is, if I don't want to keep doing running stitch all the way into the middle, I'll then put seed stitch in the middle. Partly because I like the contrast between the two stitching, but also because it squashes it down again when it starts to puff up. Very little that can't be fixed with more stitching. When we did the stacked running stitch in Solar Eclipse Week, some of us, and I include myself in that, had a little bit of tension issues and couldn't make it lie flat, but we solved it with doing more stitching. Right, so I'm coming back round to where I started, and there I do like to just have a look, and go visualize stitch, space, stitch, and slightly adjust the size of my stitches, just so that I don't end up, with something strange going on. I'm going to stab stitch there because that's quite thick. Plus I want to make sure I come up in the right place. Again, that's just a little finicky thing I have. I don't like to see, an obvious difference at the beginning and end of the circle. I'm going to leave that attached because I might go around again when I take this off and see how it looks. Yes, definitely going to go round again. That does, however, leave pinholes in that cloth. It is a bit like an Egyptian cotton. Right, where am I? Oh, there I am. So I'm just going to look, I'm having a look now, do I want to go inside or outside with my next row? I'm just going to go around the inside once more. and I feel inspired to do more on this, but this is already getting quite long for a Wednesday. Don't want Wednesdays turning into Mondays in terms of length of video. Well, some of you might, but so I think I'm going to not put it in my journal. I'll finish this circle. I won't put it in my journal for now, and I'll just leave it for a bit. I can hear movement elsewhere in the house. And if I do decide to do more stitching on it, I'll show it to you next week, before we get into next week's project, whatever that may be. I don't know yet, to be honest. So if there's a bit of bulk there because of the seams, you can just stab stitch that place. You can even just go through the surface. You don't have to go through all the layers. You know, just every now and then, if you have a place that's really bulky and you can't get your needle right through to the back and out again, you can just take a stitch in the surface of the cloth. Do you see what I mean? On the front it will look fine, just the odd stitch like that. Like here where it's bulky, I could just take a stitch into the surface of the cloth. I don't have to go all the way through. I mean, you wouldn't want to do that everywhere, obviously, but on these tricksy areas, if you did it everywhere, you wouldn't be, you know, fusing your layers together. But the odd place here and there, you can just do that. Don't stress it. Well, here I'm going to have to stab stitch because I'm going to go right over a seam junction, and I saw that when I was assessing where I was going to do my next line of stitching for my circle, and I thought, well, be alright. Okay, and it was. So stitch, space, stitch, space, I need to make them slightly bigger. And I can go stitch, space, stitch. Like so. So there we go. So I'll leave it at that. Do you see how that's starting to come up there? Because I pull my stitches too tight. It's as tight as I want to pull them, so it's not too tight. But yeah, I can just do something in there to squish that down if I want to. So that's as far as I'm going to go with that. I'll do more stitching on it through the week in quiet moments, if there are any, and I'll show it to you next week. But I hope you enjoy the Wonky Checkerboard. It's something I really love, and I think it's really, you know, can be used in so many ways, on its own or with other things. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to you joining me next time for more Cloth Tales. Bye bye.